Hello, my friends. The war in Ukraine is often reduced to a daily map update, red and blue arrows, kilometers gained, villages renamed, and an endless scoreboard of tactical movement. That framing is convenient, and it's also incomplete. The battlefield matters, but the outcome of this conflict will not be decided only by trench lines and drone footage. The bigger story is the political and strategic aftershock, the widening fractures inside Europe, the growing divergence between Europe and the United States, and the long-term shift in how major powers weigh interests, alliances, and leverage. What we are watching is a war that has become a stress test for the Western coalition, NATO states, European governments, and Washington's political leadership. Whether Russia advances another few kilometers or whether a ceasefire freezes the line where it stands, the conflict has already accelerated divisions that were forming anyway. Some people will argue the war caused those divisions. A more accurate reading is that it compressed time. Changes that might have taken a decade to surface have been forced into the open in a few years. Tactical updates and why the narrative timing matters. Let's start on the front line, because tactical developments still shape perception and political momentum. There has been significant attention on activity around Kupiansk. Maps circulating from Ukrainian-leaning sources show pockets of Ukrainian gains, while other mapping communities show a more mixed picture, particularly on the eastern side, and with contested zones that remain fluid. There are also claims and counterclaims around specific footage and whether certain events happened on a particular date, in a particular location, or were presented out of sequence. At a purely factual level, authenticity matters. But at a strategic communications level, what mattered most was the effect, the appearance of a Ukrainian success at a moment of political pressure, corruption allegations, internal scrutiny of leadership, and widening disagreement among Ukraine, Europe, and Washington over peace terms. The information environment is part of modern warfare. A tactical moment, even if limited in operational consequence, can be amplified into a morale event, a funding argument, or a diplomatic lever. That is why a relatively small success can dominate headlines, while larger strategic losses receive comparatively little attention. One example is the fall of Seversk. Regardless of how individual mapping projects shade gray zones and verified control, the broader picture has been a sharp deterioration of Ukrainian positions in that sector. A city and defensive area that had been treated as stubbornly resilient has come under Russian control far faster than many expected, especially given the years of fortification and the known difficulty of operating there due to terrain and lines of fire. This matters beyond symbolism. Terrain and topography influence artillery, geometry, observation, logistics, and the ability to maintain defensive depth. The Seversk, Bakhmut, Chasiv Yar axis has long been shaped by elevated lines and the problem of flanking fire. When a fortified position collapses, the concern is not only what is lost immediately, but what becomes possible next. Pressure towards Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, tightening logistics corridors, and forcing Ukraine to choose where to commit scarce reserves. And that leads to the core structural issue. Ukraine does not have unlimited manpower, ammunition, or reserve formations that can be moved to every crisis point simultaneously. When multiple sectors go critical at once, the defense becomes a triage system. Holding one line may mean yielding another. Modern battlefield reality, drones, saturation, and small errors with huge costs. The war's tactical character continues to punish mistakes with disproportionate casualties. In drone-saturated battle space, a minor roadblock, a stalled vehicle column, or a brief pause at the wrong choke point can turn into a catastrophic ambush. Reports of heavy Russian losses in certain approaches, vehicles stopped and then picked apart by drones, illustrate how unforgiving the environment has become. This is not about one side being smart and the other being stupid. It is about operating under constant surveillance and threat of precision strike. The margin for error is thin. And as both sides iterate, we are seeing improvisations such as attempts to blind FPV drones using infrared spotlights, an early indicator of how counter-drone measures will keep evolving, including deception, dazzlers, and active protection concepts at small unit scale. The bigger war, Europe, the United States, and the fracture line that Russia benefits from. Now to the meat of the analysis. Russia's most consequential gains may be political rather than territorial. it has become common in Western commentary to claim that Russia must lose because it has not achieved maximal initial objectives quickly, because the war is costly, because NATO expanded, and because Ukraine still exists as a state. But that conclusion depends on a narrow definition of victory that ignores broader strategic outcomes. From another perspective, Russia has succeeded in intensifying and exposing divisions among the states that oppose it. Those divisions are not cosmetic. They shape financing, sanctions, escalation thresholds, negotiating positions, and ultimately the credibility of collective defense. We can see this today in the argument over frozen Russian sovereign assets. Several European states, including major financial and politically significant ones, have publicly resisted or questioned proposals to seize or repurpose frozen Russian assets. Their objections are not sentimental. They are legal, institutional, and systemic. If European leaders acknowledge publicly that seizure conflicts with international law, that record becomes ammunition for future litigation and reputational damage. The precedent does not remain neatly contained. If the rule becomes assets are safe until politics changes, then the credibility of European financial infrastructure is weakened. Even if Europe believes it is morally justified in one specific case, financial systems are built on predictability. Undermining predictability creates second-order consequences that outlive the war. The proposed alternative joint EU debt to finance Ukraine pushes the burden onto European taxpayers, and it requires unanimity. That's where the political fracture deepens. Unanimity invites veto power. Emergency workarounds that reduce the threshold to a majority may be operationally convenient, but they raise anxiety about institutional overreach and far-reaching consequences beyond the immediate case. In other words, Europe's internal disagreement is not a footnote. It's the story, peace proposals, and the mismatch of leverage. The divergence becomes even clearer in peace negotiations. Washington's approach, especially under a leadership that frames strategy in terms of great power balance, does not necessarily mirror Europe's ideological framing or Ukraine's maximal demands. A U.S. Administration can view the European theater through the lens of global priorities, including China. In that framework, stabilizing relations with Russia, or at least reducing the temperature, can be treated as an instrument to prevent Russia from becoming an even tighter strategic partner of China. Europe, by contrast, has struggled to act as a unified great power. The EU has scale, but it is often internally quarrelsome and procedurally constrained. Even under pressure, it frequently fails to produce a single strategic line that all major members sustain over time. Ukraine, meanwhile, faces the hardest reality. Negotiating leverage is not a moral category. It is a power category. Ukraine can reject terms it considers humiliating, but it cannot change battlefield and resource asymmetries by declaration. Counter-proposals that remove the concessions the opposing side considers essential may satisfy domestic politics, but they risk collapsing talks if the other parties conclude there is no path to agreement. And here, Russia's priority has remained consistent, preventing a security architecture on its border that it treats as an unacceptable threat. Territory matters, but the security guarantee question matters more. A settlement that keeps NATO membership, de facto NATO integration, or open-ended security commitments on the table is unlikely to be acceptable to Moscow. This is where language weaponization becomes visible in Western discourse. Terms like echoing Russian talking points are often used not to rebut arguments, but to discredit the speaker, so the argument does not need to be addressed. When that dynamic intensifies, it signals that the coalition is arguing internally over narrative control as much as policy. Public opinion. Why Russia looks unified while the West looks fragmented. One of the most underappreciated differences in this war is the comparative unity of public opinion. Russia has maintained relatively stable public support for the war, often cited in the 70-80% range, with disagreement more about objectives and methods than about the foundational framing. Many Russians interpret the conflict not as a limited territorial dispute, but as a confrontation with Western pressure, Western expansion, and a perceived attempt to weaken or fragment Russia. That framing, existential rather than transactional, produces cohesion. In the West, the picture is the opposite. Disagreement across parties, across institutions, across countries, and even within alliances. The argument is not merely tactical, send more weapons versus send fewer. It is increasingly strategic and civilizational, what Europe is, what America is becoming, and whether their trajectories still align. This matters because public opinion constrains democracies in a way that is different from authoritarian systems, but it does not mean authoritarian systems are immune. Legitimacy matters everywhere. Autocracies often monitor public opinion intensely because when legitimacy cracks, failure becomes personalized and dangerous to the regime itself. War outcomes can trigger elite fragmentation, institutional panic, and cascades of blame. But in this case, the visible fragmentation is not in Russia, it is in the Western Bloc. Sanctions, endurance, and the limits of coercion. Sanctions have damaged Russia. But damage is not the same as collapse. Economic strain can be endured if the system remains stable enough and if alternative markets continue to absorb energy exports. Purchases by large states, especially in Asia, reduce the coercive reach of Western sanctions. Moreover, sanctions can produce rally effects. Populations may interpret them as foreign hostility rather than evidence of domestic failure. The same logic applies to strategic strikes. There is a persistent belief in modern commentary that pressure and pain will automatically trigger popular uprising. History often shows the opposite. External attack tends to consolidate national identity and harden resistance, even when people dislike their leaders. What victory looks like in the long game. If Russia's goal is defined narrowly, rapid conquest, quick regime change, or total military defeat of Ukraine, then the war has been costly and slow. But if the broader goal includes weakening the coherence of the Western alliance, exposing ideological divergence across the Atlantic, and accelerating Europe's internal contradictions, then Russia has gained something substantial. Even if the front line froze tomorrow, the fracture would remain, and that is why Russia can look confident. Because the war has not only been fought in fields and cities, but in institutions, budgets, legal systems, public opinion, and alliance politics. The battlefield is one layer. The alliance fracture is another, and that second layer may shape the next decade of global power alignment more than any single town captured or lost. As winter deepens, the tactical environment may favor the side with superior fires, ammunition depth, and manpower sustainability. But strategically, the most enduring effect may already be set. The West arguing with itself over money, law, identity, and priorities, while Russia benefits from the acceleration of a split that was coming anyway. And that's the point I want to leave you with. This war will end someday, either on a signature page or by exhaustion, but the real damage has already been done to the idea of a unified West. Europe is arguing over law and money. Washington is recalculating priorities in a world dominated by China. And Ukraine is stuck trying to negotiate as if leverage is a moral right instead of a power reality. Meanwhile, Russia doesn't need a perfect battlefield victory to claim a strategic one. It only needs the cracks to keep widening, because once alliances lose certainty, deterrence turns into doubt, and doubt turns into retreat. So when people ask who's winning, don't just stare at the map. Watch the politics, the courtrooms, the bond markets, and the public mood. Watch how quickly solidarity becomes conditions, how fast shared values becomes national interest, and how easily the coalition turns its frustration inward. In the long game, that is the decisive terrain. And if there's one lesson history keeps repeating, it's this. Wars don't just break cities, they break assumptions. The assumption of Western unity is breaking in real time. And once that breaks, it doesn't snap back overnight. The information space around the Ukraine war is engineered to confuse by design. Every side amplifies what helps them, buries what hurts them, and uses emotion as a substitute for proof. That's the baseline reality. But within that fog, certain patterns have become consistent. Russia communicates with strategic patience that Western capitals increasingly lack. and NATO's posture keeps drifting from support into direct operational involvement, whether they admit it openly or not. One of the most striking claims circulating in pro-Russian channels is that a group of NATO personnel, described as senior officers and advisors, were blocked in Gulay-Pole, a contested settlement in the Zaporizhia region. The claim, attributed to Nikolai Sorokin, presented as the director of a Russian institute focused on national crisis studies, alleges that Ukrainian forces attempted a counterattack to break a Russian encirclement and extract those personnel, but failed. If that happened, it wouldn't be a headline detail, it would be a structural revelation, because it would publicly puncture the rhetorical firewall the West has maintained for years. We are not a party to the conflict. We are only supporting Ukraine. And that firewall has always been more public relations device than operational boundary. The vocabulary changes, the function doesn't. Advisors, trainers, liaison officers, contractors, technical specialists, intelligence support, maintenance crews, planning cells. The West rotates terms as needed, but the battlefield reality is that Ukraine's combat effectiveness in 2024, 2025 has depended heavily on a fused ecosystem. Western intelligence and doctrine, Ukrainian manpower, NATO standard targeting logic, and supply chains that run through European political decisions. Now, a responsible analyst has to say it plainly. A claim is not confirmation. Even within the story as told, there's hedging. Some sources say possibly, not yet known for certain. War produces rumor the way fire produces smoke. And this kind of report is politically valuable, which makes it especially prone to exaggeration or selective framing. But here's the point. Even if the specific detail about Gulay-Pole is imperfect, the strategic direction it points to is undeniable. NATO is not merely shipping boxes. It is increasingly woven into the machinery of war. That's why episodes like this matter so much. If senior NATO-linked personnel were truly present in a contested pocket, it signals one of two realities. Either their role has deepened enough that they must be near operational decision points, or Ukraine's reliance on foreign expertise has reached a stage where some of that expertise is effectively forward. Either way, you get the same strategic consequence. The proxy model starts to break down because proxies are useful precisely when the sponsor can deny risk. The moment that denial becomes implausible, domestic politics in the sponsor countries gets harder and escalation dynamics become more volatile. Zaporizhia is not just a dot on a map, it's a hinge. It sits at the intersection of Russia's territorial consolidation goals and Ukraine's ability to maintain coherent logistics. Western audiences often talk about front lines as if they're static. They're not. They're living pressure systems. Russia's operational advantage has been its ability to apply pressure, rotate forces, and grind down Ukraine's capacity over time, while the West tries to manage the war through press releases, sanctions packages, and political theater. Ukraine, for its part, has been forced into a reactive posture, patching manpower shortages, adjusting to air defense depletion, and trying to keep cohesion under a constant requirement to deliver good news to sustain Western funding. This is where Russia's strategic culture matters. Moscow is not operating on election cycles, it is operating on strategic cycles. Western politics needs wins framed for TV. Russia needs outcomes framed for security. That asymmetry is brutal. It means the West is incentivized to announce, promise, and posture, while Russia is incentivized to wait, shape, and absorb. In long wars, the side that can tolerate ambiguity and endure incremental progress tends to outperform the side that requires continual public validation. That brings us to the financial warfare dimension, the Euroclear frozen assets story. The EU's move to keep Russian central bank assets frozen indefinitely is not a minor legal footnote, it's a structural signal. From a pro-Russian perspective, it confirms what Moscow has argued for years, that Western financial institutions are not neutral infrastructure, they are weapons platforms. Freeze becomes seize by stages. Rules become values when convenient. Property rights become conditional on political obedience. whether you like that framing or not, the effect is measurable. It accelerates the incentive for alternative settlement systems, makes non-Western states rethink reserve safety, and hardens Russia's expectation that negotiations with the West are never merely diplomatic, they are always paired with coercive economic mechanisms. This also explains why the peace narrative is so slippery. Western officials can speak about peace while taking steps that make compromise harder. A system that treats Russian state assets as a permanent bargaining chip is, in practice, preparing for prolonged confrontation. And inside Europe, that creates fractures. Leaders like Slovakia's Robert Fico, who signals reluctance to redirect frozen Russian funds toward Kiev and hints at restoring ties with Moscow, are not isolated by accident. They are symptoms of strain. European unity has a cost. The longer the war continues, the more that cost moves from abstract morality into concrete budgets, energy security debates, migration pressures, and electoral backlash. Now, consider the psychological layer. Information warfare. One reason pro-Russian voices gain traction is not only because they say what the West won't, but because Western messaging often collapses under its contradictions. The West insists it is not directly involved, yet it provides intelligence that is functionally inseparable from targeting and battlefield management. It insists sanctions are crippling Russia, yet Russia continues to fight, export, and adapt, often by reshaping trade flows rather than collapsing. It insists Ukraine is winning, yet the definition of winning keeps changing. First, it was territorial recovery. Then it became not losing. Then it became degrading Russia. Then it became preserving sovereignty. Then it became holding lines until the next package. This constant redefinition is not strategy. It's narrative triage. Credibility decay is fatal in long wars. When credibility decays, people stop listening to official statements and start listening to alternative frames, sometimes better, sometimes worse, but always louder. Pro-Russian interpretations often feel coherent because they hinge on one consistent claim. Russia is acting in what it defines as existential security interest and will not be negotiated out of that interest by media pressure, sanctions, or short-term political theatrics. That simple coherence is persuasive in an environment where Western messaging feels fragmented, defensive, and reactive. At the operational level, the proxy model is also under pressure because NATO-style warfighting is expensive not just in money, but in tempo and supply. Advanced air defenses, precision munitions, counter-battery systems, electronic warfare, ISR pipelines, these are not infinite pools. They depend on industrial output and political decisions, and the West has discovered that peacetime stockpiles were not built for a grinding continental conflict. The longer the war continues, the more the debate shifts from what should we send to what can we replace, and then to what can we explain to voters. Russia, by contrast, has reorganized its economy and defense production around the assumption that this is a prolonged confrontation. You can argue about the quality of outputs, but the direction is consistent. Russia is building a war posture. The West is trying to maintain a war posture while pretending it is temporary. That's why stories like Goulet Poll, whether fully verified or not, function as strategic messaging. They say there is no such thing as safe involvement. There is no such thing as a clean firewall between NATO and Ukraine when Western personnel, expertise, and operational logic are embedded in the fight. And Russia's purpose in highlighting such an episode would be to apply pressure where Western governments are most vulnerable: political legitimacy and denial. If Western capitals keep inching forward without admitting what they are doing, they create a trap of their own making. Each increment becomes harder to reverse. Each exposure event becomes more explosive. The public is told no boots on the ground, but the system increasingly requires people on the ground call them what you like. And when something goes wrong, the official story becomes thinner, more defensive, and less believable. That dynamic doesn't just risk scandal. It risks escalation because denials become commitments and commitments become obligations. So the core analytical conclusion is this: The war is exposing the real relationship between NATO and Ukraine. It is not only a supply relationship, it is a functional integration of doctrine, intelligence, planning, and sustainment. Russia has been operating as if that is the reality for a long time. The West has been speaking as if it is not. And in wars, reality wins. Whether the Goulet poll claim is eventually confirmed in detail is secondary to what it represents. A steady erosion of boundaries between proxy and participant, between support and presence, between public narrative and battlefield truth. Once those boundaries collapse, the public will learn too late that the conflict they were told was managed has been escalating in plain sight. In the end, this war will not be decided by slogans, sanctions packages, or carefully scripted press conferences. It will be decided by endurance, by industrial reality, by political cohesion or the lack of it, and by which side understands what kind of war this actually is. Russia understands. The West is still debating how to describe it. For Moscow, Ukraine is not a theater. It is not a moral stage. It is not a branding exercise. It is a hard security problem on Russia's border, tied to history, geography, demography, and survival. That framing does not change every 6 months. It does not depend on polling. It does not require applause. It simply persists. And in long wars, persistence beats performance. NATO, by contrast, is trapped in a contradiction of its own making. It must escalate enough to prevent Ukrainian collapse, but not so openly that it admits co-belligerency. It must promise victory without defining what victory means. It must signal resolve while managing fear of direct confrontation. And it must do all of this through political systems that punish honesty and reward illusion. That is not a stable position. It is a balancing act that becomes harder with every month that passes. Episodes like the Goulet poll story, whether fully confirmed or not, matter because they expose that contradiction. They remind everyone that there is no clean line between support and involvement. Once intelligence, planning, logistics, and advisory structures are embedded into active combat operations. They remind everyone that deniability erodes faster than officials expect. And they remind everyone that Russia is watching not just the battlefield, but the political psychology of its adversaries. The deeper NATO goes without acknowledging reality, the narrower its exit options become. Each step forward raises the cost of stepping back. Each denial hardens future commitments. And each attempt to manage perception instead of strategy accelerates credibility loss at home. That is how long wars are lost, not in a single dramatic defeat, but in slow erosion, in exhaustion masked as resolve, in unity maintained by repetition rather than conviction. Russia's strategy does not require Western collapse. It requires Western fatigue. It requires time. It requires pressure applied consistently enough that fractures emerge naturally between states, between elites and voters, between promises and capabilities. That process is already visible. Disagreements over funding, quiet dissent inside the EU, shifting rhetoric about realistic outcomes, a growing gap between official optimism and private assessments. None of this happens by accident. And this is the part most Western audiences are not told. Wars like this rarely end with theatrical conclusions. They end when one side quietly accepts that its objectives are no longer achievable at acceptable cost. That moment is not announced. It is felt. It shows up in budget debates, in softened language, in reassessments, in sudden interest in diplomacy, framed as pragmatism rather than necessity. When that moment comes, the narrative will change. It always does. The same voices that promised decisive victory will speak about restraint. The same institutions that rejected compromise will rediscover realism. And the same analysts who dismissed Russia's staying power will explain after the fact why the outcome was inevitable. Russia is preparing for that moment. The West is postponing it. And that is why the most dangerous illusion surrounding this war is not escalation, it is control. The belief that this conflict can be managed indefinitely through messaging, money, and incremental adjustments is the illusion that breaks first. Reality does not negotiate with narratives. It does not respond to hashtags. It responds to capacity, coherence, and will. In that contest, Time is not neutral. Time is a weapon, and right now, it is not working in NATO's favor. Let me begin with a simple question, because sometimes the most obvious questions expose the deepest contradictions. If you deposit your money in a bank, do you expect it to be safe? Do you expect access to it when you choose, without political interference, delays, or arbitrary conditions? Most people would answer yes without hesitation. That expectation is the foundation of modern finance, international investment, and trust in institutions. And it is precisely that foundation the European Union is now deliberately destroying. The major development driving this analysis is the European Union's decision to approve a legal mechanism allowing Russian state assets to remain frozen indefinitely. This is not a temporary wartime measure anymore. It is no longer framed as an emergency response. It has become policy permanent, structural, and openly political. Russia has already responded by filing a lawsuit against Euroclear, the Belgian-based depository holding a large share of the frozen assets. But Russia is not alone in criticizing this move. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, joined by several other EU member states, has issued one of the clearest warnings yet about what this decision represents. Not solidarity, not rule of law, but the erosion of sovereignty itself inside the European Union. Orban's objections are routinely misrepresented by Brussels and Western media. The claim is that he is simply defending Russian money. That is false. What Orban is defending is the veto, the last remaining safeguard of national sovereignty within the EU framework. Under EU treaties, major decisions on foreign policy, sanctions, defense, and enlargement require unanimity. That unanimity is not procedural clutter. It is the core guarantee that smaller states are not steamrolled by larger ones or by unelected bureaucracies. The veto is not an inconvenience, it is the mechanism that prevents empire. By eliminating the unanimity requirement under the guise of emergency powers, the European Commission has crossed a legal and political Rubicon. Orban is correct when he says this maneuver is illegal. It violates both the letter and spirit of EU treaties. More importantly, it establishes a precedent. If unanimity can be discarded once, it can be discarded again, and eventually forever. Brussels argues that extraordinary times justify extraordinary measures. But what exactly is the emergency? Russia is not an EU member. Ukraine is not an EU member. There is no existential threat to EU territory. The emergency exists only as a political narrative designed to consolidate power at the Commission level. This is not solidarity. Solidarity is voluntary. What Brussels is imposing is obedience. The long-term consequences of this decision cannot be overstated. The entire world is watching. Russia is watching. China is watching. The BRICS nations are watching. The global South is watching. Even the United States, the IMF, and the European Central Bank have quietly warned against this course of action. Once assets can be seized indefinitely based on political alignment, no foreign capital is truly safe in Europe. This is why Italy's intervention matters. Italy, along with Belgium, Malta, and Bulgaria, has publicly expressed opposition to the outright seizure and redistribution of Russian assets to Ukraine. These are not fringe states. Italy is one of the EU's largest economies and voting powers. Their concern is not ideological. It is legal and financial. They understand that once this door is opened, it cannot be closed. These countries have asked Brussels for alternatives. That request is performative. Everyone involved knows there is no alternative. There is no hidden pool of money waiting to sustain Ukraine for years. The European Commission's desperation stems from a simple reality. The Ukraine project is financially unsustainable without confiscation. And yet, instead of admitting this reality, EU leaders pretend that another solution exists somewhere, somehow, if only Ursula von der Leyen can find it. This is not strategy. It is denial. What makes this even more absurd is that these same countries voted to grant the Commission emergency powers in the first place. Now, they express concern that the Commission might abuse those powers. That outcome was not accidental. It was inevitable. The EU operates like a body where the Commission is the brain and member states are the limbs. Once the brain issues commands, the body executes them, often against its own interests. And when consequences arrive, leaders will claim they had no choice. That excuse will not hold. Russia's legal response is equally predictable. Moscow understands that EU courts will never recognize rulings from Russian arbitration. That is not the point. The lawsuit against Euroclear is a warning shot. If Europe continues down this path, Russia will respond in kind, freezing European assets, initiating legal actions across multiple jurisdictions, and accelerating the fragmentation of the global financial system. This is how Pandora's box is opened. Saudi Arabia has already warned that foreign investors will reconsider exposure to Europe. Others will follow. Trust, once lost, does not return easily. Against this backdrop, we see another maneuver. The attempt to embed Ukraine's EU membership into a so-called peace plan with a target date before the 1st of January 2027. This has nothing to do with peace. Ukraine has not completed a single one of the 36 accession chapters required for EU membership. Not one. To suggest accelerated accession under these conditions is to abandon the merit-based framework entirely. But that framework has already been hollowed out elsewhere. This is simply the most blatant example. The real objective is once again Viktor Orban's veto. By embedding accession into a peace agreement, Brussels hopes to morally blackmail dissenting states. Accept this or be accused of sabotaging peace. It is coercion disguised as consensus. Even you, as support for such a plan, would not change the fundamental problem. You cannot override sovereignty indefinitely without consequences. You cannot build unity by destroying consent. Finally, we arrive at the corruption question, the one Western media prefers to whisper about rather than confront. Reports of secret meetings between Ukraine's chief negotiator and senior FBI leadership raise more questions than answers. Whether these meetings were about immunity, leverage, or pressure, none of the possibilities reflect well on Kyiv's leadership. If corruption investigations are being negotiated behind closed doors, that alone confirms what many already know. Corruption is not a side issue in Ukraine, it is systemic. If, alternatively, these meetings are being used to pressure Ukraine into accepting painful concessions, that merely underscores the reality that Kyiv's bargaining position is collapsing. Either way, the picture is bleak. None of this is surprising. The European Union has chosen ideology over law, emotion over structure, and obedience over sovereignty. Russia did not force these decisions. Brussels made them willingly. The tragedy is not that Europe is losing credibility. The tragedy is that it is doing so knowingly and dragging its member states with it. That is the reality unfolding now, whether Brussels admits it or not. In the end, what we are witnessing is not merely a dispute over frozen assets, accession timelines, or emergency powers. What is unfolding is the quiet collapse of the very principles the European Union once claimed to embody. Rule of law is being replaced by rule of expediency. Sovereignty is being sacrificed for conformity. Legal norms are bent, then broken, in service of a war that Europe is neither winning nor capable of sustaining on its own terms. Russia did not force the European Union to abandon unanimity. Russia did not compel Brussels to weaponize finance, to hollow out treaties, or to treat national vetoes as obstacles rather than safeguards. These were choices, deliberate, calculated choices made by European leaders who believed short-term political alignment mattered more than long-term institutional survival. The consequences will not be immediate, but they will be irreversible. Capital will move elsewhere, trust will erode. Legal credibility, once lost, will not be restored by speeches or summits. And when Europe eventually looks for someone to blame, it will find that the damage was self-inflicted. Ukraine will not be saved by confiscated assets or accelerated paperwork. Peace will not be achieved by coercion disguised as solidarity. And sovereignty cannot be preserved by pretending it no longer matters. History is unforgiving in moments like this. It records not intentions, but outcomes. And the outcome now taking shape is clear. In trying to punish Russia, the European Union has begun dismantling itself, one legal exception, one emergency clause, one discarded veto at a time. What we are witnessing now is not a series of disconnected events, but the slow, grinding exposure of Western strategic delusion, military, financial, and political, colliding head-on with Russian reality. Let's begin with the financial front, because this is where Europe has done something historically reckless. The permanent immobilization of Russian sovereign assets, celebrated loudly by Ursula von der Leyen and Brussels bureaucrats, marks a fundamental rupture in global financial norms. Russia has already initiated legal proceedings against Euroclear in Moscow, and this is not symbolic theater. The Russian central bank will win in Russian courts, and everyone involved knows it. Euroclear will not meaningfully contest the case there. That victory is only the opening salvo. From Moscow, Russia will expand the legal offensive globally. Euroclear operates across jurisdictions, and Russia will pursue its claims wherever Euroclear maintains a footprint. Belgium alone holds roughly 18 billion in assets inside Russia, assets that are now effectively gone. The broader implication is more severe. Euroclear itself faces existential risk. Analysts are openly discussing whether this institution could collapse under the legal, reputational, and financial weight of its actions. Meanwhile, political cracks inside the European Union are widening. Belgium, Slovakia, Malta, Bulgaria, and now Italy have all signaled resistance to transferring frozen Russian assets to Kyiv. Italy joining Belgium in opposition is not a minor footnote, it is a heavyweight defection. The damage is already done. Capital around the world is taking note. Europe has destroyed its own reputation as a neutral, rules-based financial hub, all in service of Ukraine. This is not support for Ukraine. This is financial self-immolation. At the same time, Russia's geopolitical positioning continues to strengthen. While Western media obsesses over optics, Vladimir Putin conducts serious diplomacy. During his meeting with Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkmenistan, the Turkish president was engaged in extended talks that ran over schedule long enough that Pakistan's prime minister kept waiting, abruptly inserted himself into the discussion. That alone tells you who commands attention. What followed is far more revealing. Within hours of that meeting, Russian Iskander missiles and Jiran drones struck the port of Odessa, hitting a cargo vessel reportedly flagged in Panama, but linked to Turkey. The official claim was that it carried generators. Video evidence suggests otherwise. Regardless, this strike was not random. It was a calibrated response. Ukraine, with Western backing, possibly including French assistance, has targeted Russian oil tankers, including vessels belonging to the so-called Shadow Fleet, operating outside London insurance structures. 4 tankers have been hit, 3 in the Black Sea and 1 off West Africa. Russia warned clearly that retaliation would follow. It did. This is escalation management, Russian style. Now contrast that with American behavior at sea. The United States seized a tanker carrying oil from China to Iran, an operation that occurred a month ago but was only now leaked to the Wall Street Journal. Why now? Because Washington is attempting to distract from its unlawful seizure of a Venezuelan tanker, an act that enraged much of the international community. The timing is not coincidence. It is narrative control. Iran, unsurprisingly, responded by seizing a tanker in the Gulf of Oman carrying millions of liters of smuggled diesel. This is what maritime lawlessness produces. Retaliation spirals, rising insurance costs, disrupted supply chains, and global instability. The only certainty is higher prices and greater risk for commercial shipping. Against this backdrop of real strategic consequences, we are treated to theater from Kyiv. Vladimir Zelensky released a carefully staged propaganda video claiming to be in Kupiansk, attempting to refute Russian advances. Geolocation evidence quickly showed he was actually positioned kilometers outside the city, likely in an abandoned industrial facility. This was not bravery, this was desperation. Ukraine supporters cheered the spectacle, calling it heroic. It was nothing of the sort. It was a man trying to prove relevance to Western patrons, particularly Washington. Putin does not need to perform TikTok diplomacy. Russia is winning on the battlefield. Kupiansk has fallen. The fact that Russian forces have not yet cleared every surrounding kilometer does not alter the strategic reality. Zelensky's appearance changed nothing militarily. What it did reveal was panic. Even more revealing was the fixation on his expensive new smartphone, an iPhone no ordinary Ukrainian could afford during wartime. Symbols matter. This one was not flattering. Now we arrive at the so-called peace process. According to Axios, meetings are taking place in Berlin, not Kyiv, between Zelensky and U.S. intermediaries. The proposed plan reportedly has three components: reconstruction funding, security guarantees, and territorial arrangements. The most absurd element is the suggestion that the United States might offer Ukraine Article 5-like security guarantees. This is fantasy. Russia will never accept NATO-style guarantees for Ukraine, whether formally or under another name. Moscow has been explicit. Washington, Brussels, and Kyiv can negotiate endlessly among themselves, but none of it matters until Russia is involved. And when Russia reviews these proposals, the response will be immediate and final: unacceptable. The so-called peace plan closely mirrors a CIA-aligned proposal recently floated in U.S. media, a plan that amounts to Russian capitulation. It will go nowhere. Even Zelensky's proposal for territorial referendums was swiftly dismissed by senior Russian officials. Ushakov and Peskov stated plainly, those territories are Russian under the Russian Constitution. There is nothing to vote on. Finally, there are reports of secret meetings in Florida involving U.S. security officials and Zelensky's chief negotiator. Western media speculates about pressure tactics. The more plausible explanation is quieter and more revealing: discussions about amnesty and post-war survival. People closest to failing regimes always look for exits. Strip away the propaganda, and the picture is clear. Russia holds the strategic initiative militarily, diplomatically, and increasingly financially. Europe has sacrificed its credibility. The United States has escalated maritime confrontations it cannot control. Ukraine is performing optics while bleeding territory, and the so-called peace process is being conducted without the one actor who actually decides the outcome. Negotiations will happen on Russian terms. That is not bravado. That is reality. In the end, history will not remember this conflict the way Western commentators hope it will. It will not be framed as a noble struggle, heroically defended by press conferences, social media videos, or carefully staged appearances a few kilometers away from the front lines. Wars are not won on optics. They are won on logistics, manpower, industrial capacity, strategic patience, and political will. On every one of those metrics, Russia holds the advantage, and increasingly, it holds it decisively. The West has exhausted its playbook. Sanctions have failed. Asset seizures have backfired. Military aid has prolonged the fighting without changing the outcome. Diplomatic theatrics have replaced serious negotiation, while Europe quietly fractures under the weight of its own contradictions. Financial institutions, once trusted by the world, are now exposed as political instruments, and that damage will echo far beyond Ukraine. Ukraine, meanwhile, is being encouraged to negotiate illusions, security guarantees that will never be honored, reconstruction funds that depend on endless war, and territorial fantasies that contradict both battlefield realities and constitutional facts. Kiev is not being prepared for peace. It is being prepared for disappointment. And the longer this continues, the harsher the reckoning will be. Russia does not need to rush. Time is no longer working against Moscow. It is working against those who refuse to acknowledge reality. Every month that passes strengthens Russia's position while eroding Western unity, credibility, and economic stability. Eventually, negotiations will come. They always do. But when they arrive, they will not resemble the plans being discussed in Berlin, Brussels, or Washington today. They will be grounded in facts on the ground, not slogans. They will reflect Russian security interests, not Western wishful thinking. And they will mark not the defeat of Ukraine alone, but the collapse of a broader illusion that power can be manufactured by narrative and that consequences can be avoided by denial. The history is moving forward, whether the West is ready or not. Russia understands this. And that, more than anything else, is why the outcome is no longer in doubt.